2014. The black flag ascended over Mosul. The world focused its lens entirely on the fighters. Cameras tracked the convoys of pickup trucks and the bearded commanders. Headlines screamed the names of ruthless leaders. But in the background, another force existed. At first glance, silent shadows in full niqabs, but in reality, the wives stood right behind the terror. They managed the homes while the men managed the war. Then, the tide turned. Coalition jets screamed overhead. The strongholds crumbled into dust and rebar. Why did these women believe they were safe? They trusted the absolute power of their husbands. But when the walls of the Caliphate collapsed, that power evaporated. Rank offered no protection against mortar fire. There was no escape. The footage shows women emerging from the ruins covered in gray ash. Their hands are empty. It got worse. The victims of the regime demanded justice. The locals did not offer mercy. The wives faced a vengeance as cold as the system they once supported. The reckoning had arrived. June 29, 2014. The air in the Great Mosque of Mosul was heavy with heat and tension. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi ascended the pulpit and declared the dawn of the ISIS Caliphate. His voice was calm, but his demand was absolute. It was not merely a call to arms for male fighters, it was a summons for women. He demanded they migrate to build the foundation of a new Islamic empire. The speech did not stay within the mosque walls. It was uploaded, shared, and amplified. Footage shows propaganda videos spreading across Twitter and Telegram at lightning speed. Within weeks, the borders of Iraq and Syria became porous. Men poured in from every corner of the globe, and trailing them were the women, wives, brides, widows of Jihad. Some had been married to insurgents long before the black flag rose over Mosul. Others traveled alone. They boarded planes in Europe, North Africa, and Central Asia. They crossed through Turkey, slipped through wire fences, and vanished into the desert. Online recruiters worked 24 hours a day. They promised these women a life of purpose, dignity, and religious purity. At first glance, a pilgrimage to paradise, but in reality, a descent into a total surveillance state. Upon arrival, the illusion broke. In cities like Mosul, Raqqa, and Fallujah, the militants did not build new infrastructure, they stole it. ISIS units kicked down the doors of homes, schools, and hospitals. They seized the property of the displaced and the dead. The wives of high-ranking commanders moved into these stolen villas. The contrast was sharp. The camera records, marble floors, and stocked refrigerators for the elite. Outside, the local population starved. While Iraqi and Syrian families scavenged for bread, ISIS wives enjoyed electricity from private generators. They drank clean water. They received supplies brought in through illicit smuggling networks. But comfort came with a price. Not everyone in these houses walked in freely. Why did the militants capture thousands of women? It wasn't just for labor. It was a demonstration of dominance. Yazidi and Christian women were dragged from their villages. They were not brides, they were spoils of war. Soldiers forced them into marriages that were legal only in the eyes of the terrorists. For these captives, the title of wife was a euphemism for slavery. They were locked in rooms, abused, and sold between fighters like livestock. There was no escape. But among the foreign arrivals, many were not victims. They were willing executioners. Some loyal wives refused to be silent partners. They demanded authority. In Raqqa, the Caliphate formed the Al-Khansah Brigade. This was an all-female police unit. Most members were foreign wives of ISIS commanders. They patrolled the dusty streets in full black niqabs. They carried automatic weapons. They carried whips. Their job was enforcement. The sound of their patrols cleared the markets. They checked for any sliver of exposed skin. They punished any woman who spoke too loudly. The penalties were immediate: lashings, imprisonment in cramped cells, even execution. The locals feared the Al-Khansah Brigade as much as the male death squads. By 2015, the scale of this migration became clear. Intelligence agencies flagged the numbers. More than 4,700 foreign women had crossed into ISIS territory. They held passports from Tunisia, France, Germany, Russia, and the United Kingdom. Some were teenagers who lied to their parents. Others were widows of previous conflicts, looking for a second chance at radicalism. They tied their fates to the regime. They believed the black flag would fly forever. In the frame, women walking through the markets of Raqqa, flanked by armed guards, they felt protected by the violence of their husbands. They lived in the seized mansions and ignored the rumble of distant artillery. But the enemies of ISIS were multiplying. The coalition air forces were already mapping the coordinates. The wives did not realize the truth. The power that gave them authority was about to turn their sanctuary into a graveyard. There was no turning back. 2016. That was the year the expansion stopped. The so-called Caliphate was no longer growing. It was shrinking. Maps changed colors, flags were torn down, cities that ISIS had once controlled with an iron grip began to fall. One by one, the retreat was chaotic. But the real breaking point came in October 2016. The battle for Mosul began. Iraq's second-largest city became a cage. The Iraqi army, Kurdish forces, and coalition allies surrounded the perimeter. They tightened the noose step by step. Airstrikes smashed supply lines. Bridges collapsed into the Tigris River. ISIS checkpoints turned to rubble. Why did the resistance crumble? It wasn't just superior firepower, it was hunger. Food disappeared. Medicine ran out. The footage shows market shelves are bare, and civilians are scavenging for scraps. Ordinary families were trapped behind concrete walls. And in the middle of this siege, the wives of the ISIS leaders found themselves cornered. Inside the city, the hierarchy began to crack. Commanders like Abu Abdurrahman al-Balawi and Abu Muslim al-Turkmani panicked. They tried to disguise themselves as civilians. They attempted to slip through the lines, but the people saw through the deception. At first glance, they were refugees, but in reality, they were fugitives. The locals had eyes everywhere. Many had lost brothers to executioners. Fathers had vanished into prisons. Children had been taken. Now, the population was filled with rage. When these wives and family members were caught trying to flee, the reaction was violent. Some were beaten to death on the spot. Stones and metal bars ended their lives in the street. For the victims' families, this was revenge. For the women, it was a brutal end to years of privilege. But the violence escalated. Mosul's old city became the final kill box. The alleys were narrow. Tanks could not enter. Soldiers had to clear the area on foot. Families packed into dark cellars and basements to escape the mortar fire. Women clutched their children while bombs fell from the sky. The sound of crumbling masonry was constant. Some women begged the Iraqi soldiers for mercy. They hoped their children could survive, even if they faced prison. But others made a different choice. A number of ISIS wives strapped on suicide belts. They hid the explosives under heavy black robes. They waited in the darkness. When soldiers kicked down the doors, the women did not surrender. They detonated. The blasts killed advancing troops. They killed neighbors. They killed their own children. There was no turning back. Their deaths did not come in the way they imagined. There was no glory, no safety, no protection from the leadership. Their last hours were spent in damp, dark cellars, with the ground shaking from explosions overhead. The bunker became a tomb. 3 years. That was how long Raqqa served as the absolute center of the Caliphate. From 2014 until 2017, this city was the self-declared capital. It was the brain of the operation. Orders were issued from these offices. Propaganda videos were filmed in these streets. The group's most powerful leaders moved their families here, occupying stolen mansions and government buildings. They believed the city was untouchable. But was it a sanctuary? For a time, perhaps. But by 2017, the trap snapped shut. The Syrian Democratic Forces surrounded the perimeter. Heavy United States airstrikes hammered the city infrastructure day and night. For the wives of the commanders, Raqqa transformed. At first glance, a fortress, but in reality, a cage. The city was bursting at the seams. Thousands of fighters had relocated their families, convinced this was the safest stronghold left. Housing was scarce. Some women lived in relative luxury, subsisting on food and supplies smuggled across the lines. Others huddled in crumbling concrete shells. Dust covered everything. The ground shook constantly from the impact of bombs. One figure stood out among the leadership: Turki al-Banali, a cleric from Bahrain. who had climbed the ranks to become the group's chief religious scholar. His wife and children lived with him in the eye of the storm. They moved constantly, shifting from one safe house to another to avoid detection. But movement could not save them forever. In May 2017, a missile found its target. Al-Ben Ali was killed instantly. His family's life collapsed in a second. The widow did not wait. She gathered the children and attempted to break out of the encirclement, but she was quickly intercepted. The camera records Kurdish fighters pulling a woman from a dark, narrow opening. She was hiding in the underground tunnel network. These subterranean passages were the last refuge for the elite families. Other women never made it that far. As the siege tightened, the local population saw an opening. These civilians had lived under the terror of the Black Flag for years. They knew exactly which houses belonged to the leadership. The fear was gone. Wives suspected of connections to the commanders were dragged from their hiding places. There were no trials. Some were beaten on the pavement. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. In the public squares, women were burned alive by the mob. Years of suppressed terror had turned into a sudden explosion of anger. 2018. The map of the Caliphate was burning. Cities fell one by one, slipping out of ISIS control like sand through fingers. What was once a monolithic empire spanning Iraq and Syria crumbled into isolated patches of desert. Deir az-Zur became the final coordinate for the retreat. It was not a sanctuary. It was a trap. Fighters, their wives, and terrified children packed into the backs of pickup trucks. They crammed into small villages along the Euphrates River. They moved constantly. They slept in shifts to escape the relentless bombardment and the advancing troops. For the women, the illusion of luxury vanished. Many ended up in detention centers like Al-Hol and Raqqa. Turkish forces guarded the perimeter. The camps filled rapidly. Tens of thousands of women and children flooded the gates. The footage shows an endless sea of white tents stretching to the horizon. At first glance, a refugee settlement, but in reality, a zone of slow death. Life inside was impossible. In winter, the ground turned into freezing mud that swallowed shoes. In summer, the sun blistered the skin. Food was a rare commodity: a scoop of rice, a piece of bread, a handful of lentils. Water was scarce, and hygiene was non-existent. Disease moved through the tents faster than the wind. Mothers fought a losing battle to keep their children alive. Babies died from malnutrition. Infections went untreated. The sound of coughing filled the night. Why did they stay? They had no passports and no money. But mostly, they had nowhere to go. Among the desperate faces were the Bethnal Green Girls. They had left London in 2015 wearing neat school uniforms. Now, they wore filthy rags. Some were widows. Others nursed children fathered by dead fighters. They were not alone. Thousands of women from Europe, Asia, and North Africa were trapped in the same nightmare. Their home governments rejected them. The locals despised them as the faces of ISIS cruelty. But this was only the beginning of the horror. Not every woman made it to the camps. On the front lines, Syrian soldiers and rival militias showed zero mercy. Identification checks were lethal. If a woman was linked to a senior commander, the punishment was instant: a bullet. The camera records, soldiers dragging women from the ruins. Some were executed in front of their screaming children. Others were forced into vehicles and never seen again. The chaos made statistics impossible. Stories of summary executions in villages became common. Bodies were left behind in unmarked mass graves. The sand covered the evidence. March 23, 2019. On this date, the physical territory of the so-called Caliphate effectively ceased to exist. Bodies were not buried with ceremony. They were dumped in shallow pits or left to rot in open trenches. By early spring, the war against ISIS entered its terminal phase. Where did the army that once controlled two nations go? It shrank. It collapsed into a single dusty village named Baghouz. This settlement on the banks of the Euphrates River became the final cage. Thousands of fighters and their families retreated here. The most feared terror group on Earth was now trapped in a patch of land measuring less than 2 square miles. Drone footage records the scene, a sprawling, chaotic junkyard of tents. The conditions inside Baghouz were catastrophic. Wives of fighters stitched together blankets, blue plastic tarps, and jagged scraps of metal. They built fragile shelters against the wind. But canvas could not stop shrapnel. Smoke from relentless airstrikes turned the day into night. Gunfire rattled constantly across the fields. Resources hit zero. Food was gone, water was scarce. The camera captures the misery. Children are too weak to cry from hunger. Mothers clawed at the hard earth, digging shallow foxholes to place their babies inside, hoping the dirt would shield them from the blast waves. Every sunrise felt like the final deadline. American Predator drones circled overhead 24 hours a day. They watched every movement. On the ground, Kurdish fighters from the Syrian Democratic Forces advanced meter by meter. They cut off every road. They sealed every exit. Wives of senior leaders, including the spouse of ISIS spokesman Abu Hassan al-Muhajir, found themselves cornered. At first glance, a refugee camp filled with civilians, but in reality, a final defensive line. Some women did not hide. They picked up Kalashnikovs. They stood shoulder to shoulder with their husbands, ready to kill. Others clutched their infants, waiting for the inevitable impact. Then came the final assault. It was brutal. Airstrikes pulverized the camp. Tents evaporated in balls of fire. Hundreds died within 48 hours. Visuals from the front line show the desperation. Many women refused to surrender. They strapped suicide vests to their chests and detonated them among the approaching troops. Others sprinted across the open desert, trying to break the line, only to be cut down by heavy machine gun fire. They were identified as active threats. There was no turning back. Some chose a darker exit. One report details a grim pact among a group of wives. They gathered inside a single tent. They poured fuel. They struck a match. They chose to burn alive rather than face capture by the enemy. To them, prison was worse than death. For others, the bombs made the choice for them. Families were buried where they sat, covered in the debris of their last stronghold. The black flag fell. But for the wives who walked out of the smoke, the nightmare had only just begun. 60,000 prisoners. That was the population of the new city of nightmares constructed after the fall of Baghouz. For the wives of the fighters, the surrender was not an end. It was a transition to a slower form of hell. They were herded into detention camps in northeastern Syria. The most notorious was Al-Hol. The conditions were medieval. Families lived in thin plastic tents that offered zero protection. In winter, the wind froze the water in the buckets. In summer, the heat turned the camp into an oven. The smell of sewage hung over the aisles. Water was contaminated. Food was scarce. Medical care was a myth, but the physical suffering was secondary. Why did the violence continue inside the cages? It seemed the war was over, but for the true believers, the Caliphate still existed. The camps became incubators for rage. Hardline women refused to accept defeat. They organized secret police units within the tents. They enforced Sharia law with knives and rocks. Any woman who removed her veil or spoke against the ideology was marked as a traitor. At first glance, a refugee center, but in reality, an active battlefield. The punishment for dissent was death. 2019. In that single year, 80 murders were reported inside Al-Hol. The methods were intimate and brutal. Women were stabbed while they slept. Others were strangled with tent ropes in the dead of night. The guards were not safe either. They faced sudden attacks with smuggled knives and sharpened metal shards. The children watched it all. They grew up in the dirt, surrounded by violence. There were no schools, no toys, no playgrounds. Instead, they received an education in hate. Mothers gathered their sons and whispered stories of martyrdom. They taught them that the world outside the fence was the enemy. Aid workers issued warnings. They saw a new generation of soldiers rising from the dust. But the world looked away. But the horror did not stay behind the fences. In Iraq, the shadow of ISIS remained dark and heavy. The group had left behind thousands of corpses and destroyed cities. The survivors wanted blood. When the regime fell, the anger of ordinary citizens boiled over. In towns like Tikrit and Fallujah, The police stood aside. Families of victims did not wait for the courts. They became the judges and the executioners. Many locals viewed the wives as accomplices. Some women had helped recruit fighters. Others had managed the finances. Some had pointed out neighbors to the death squads. Guilt was assumed by association. By 2017, the hunt was on. Stories spread of women being dragged from refugee centers and punished in the town squares. The footage shows a chaotic scene in Tikrit. A woman is pulled into the street. She was the widow of an ISIS emir. The mob surrounds her. These were men who had lost brothers and sons to mass executions. There was no trial. They stoned her to death while the crowd chanted. In Fallujah, the revenge was even more systematic. Videos uploaded to the internet reveal the process. Women in black robes were lined up against concrete walls. Makeshift judges delivered verdicts in seconds. There was no defense, no appeal. The firing squads raised their rifles. The sound of gunshots echoed off the ruined buildings. The bodies were left where they fell. For many Iraqis, prison was an insult. They believed only death could balance the scales. In Mosul, the violence was indiscriminate. Locals attacked houses linked to ISIS members. They set homes on fire with the families inside. Militias seized women on the street and handed them over for swift execution. Human rights groups stopped counting the dead. The numbers were too high to verify. This was not justice. This was revenge without limits. 10 minutes. That was all it took to decide a human life. Revenge had no limits here. Not every ISIS wife died in the chaos of street battles. Special units dragged the survivors into Baghdad courtrooms. The Iraqi government made a cold decision: show absolutely no mercy. Between 2018 and 2020, hundreds of women stood in the dock. The camera records: women in dusty abayas, heads bowed, standing inside cramped wooden cages. Many were not locals. They had traveled from Russia, Germany, France, and the United States. They crossed borders to marry fighters. Now, far from home, they faced Iraqi judges who had seen their country burn for years. The trials were fast. They were unforgiving. There were no expensive lawyers. There were no complex defense strategies. How did the system process them so quickly? It seemed impossible to try hundreds fairly, but the judges were not looking for nuance. They asked one single question: were you married to a fighter? If the woman whispered yes, the trial was effectively over. That answer alone guaranteed a death sentence or life in prison. To the court, a wedding ring was a weapon. It was definitive proof of loyalty to the insurgency. The punishments were public and immediate. In 2018, a Russian woman stood before the tribunal. She was only 20 years old. She admitted to following her husband to Mosul. The state executed her. A year earlier, a German citizen faced the same judge. She lived under the regime. She supported the cause. The gavel came down. Death. At first glance, they looked like young, misguided mothers, but in reality, Iraq saw them as gears in a murder machine. Dozens from France, Turkey, and Central Asia faced the same fate. The government did not see victims. It saw accomplices who enabled the slaughter of thousands of Iraqis. But this was only the beginning. Even those who escaped the hangman's noose did not truly escape. It got worse. Life in the detention centers stripped away all humanity. The smell of rot filled the corridors. Torture was systematic. Guards used heavy batons and electric shocks. Beatings became a daily routine. Many women never made it to the gallows. They died on cold concrete floors from disease and abuse long before their sentences were carried out. The prison itself became a slow, agonizing executioner. These women looked to their home nations for rescue. But officials in Paris, London, and Berlin turned their backs. They declared these citizens too dangerous to return. The diplomatic message was blunt: stay in the ruins and face justice there. By 2019, the scale of the crisis was visible from the sky. Satellite footage shows endless rows of white tents in the Syrian desert. Reports confirmed that more than 7,000 foreign wives and children were trapped in these camps. Their husbands were gone. Some were blown apart by airstrikes. Others were captured and shot. The women were left behind in the dust. They had no passports to return to and no path forward. The story ended in a cage. Zero options remained. There was simply no way to move forward. The camps had turned into open-air prisons, and desperation began to set in. Some women refused to wait for death. They looked for cracks in the perimeter. Smuggling networks expanded rapidly inside the tents. It was a lucrative business. For thousands of dollars, smugglers made bold promises. They guaranteed safe passage across the border into Turkey or a route back into the chaos of Iraq. A handful of women paid the bribe and disappeared into the night. They succeeded. But for most, the attempt ended in disaster. Why did they risk everything? The answer is simple. Staying meant a slow, inevitable end. But the escape routes were traps. Many were intercepted miles from freedom. Others didn't even make it past the wire. The camera records, guards raising their rifles. They opened fire on the figures running through the dust. They didn't shoot to warn. They shot to kill. The danger wasn't just the bullets. It was their identity. The families of ISIS's top commanders carried the weight of their husbands' names. For the enemies of the group, that name alone was a verdict. It sealed their fate instantly. October 26, 2019. Idlib. The night sky lit up. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi detonated his suicide vest during a U.S. Special Forces raid. The explosion shook the world. But this was only the beginning. The story didn't end with the leader's death. His surviving wives were hunted down. They were captured. In this dangerous game, they became living trophies. Several militant factions had no interest in keeping them as prisoners. They wanted them erased. At first glance, these were just widows. But in reality, they were symbols of a fallen regime. Some were quietly executed. Killers dumped their bodies in unmarked secret graves. The goal was cold and pragmatic. Ensure no trace of Baghdadi's bloodline survived to inspire a new generation. The pattern repeated itself 3 years later. February 3, 2022. Atme, near the Turkish border. U.S. forces surrounded another safe house. Inside was Baghdadi's successor, Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qurashi. He refused to be taken. Qurashi triggered a massive bomb. The blast was instantaneous. He killed himself, but he didn't die alone. He took his children and his wives with him. The entire floor collapsed. The footage shows piles of concrete and twisted metal. Their bodies were crushed under tons of rubble. For the global news cycle, it was another strategic blow to ISIS leadership. For the families inside, it was a brutal, ugly end. No dignity, just burial in dust and blood. Today, the wives of the commanders are scattered. They lie in hidden graves, sit in high-security prisons, or rot in the corners of dusty camps. Few remain alive. They met their last hours in absolute pain.